The contract was signed in black ink, blotting heavily on the parchment, sealing a human life for £4,000. Josephine didn't scream when her aunt handed her over. There was no point. The Duke of Whitmore was widely rumoured to be a scarred, reclusive brute who broke horses and men with equal apathy. As the heavy carriage doors snapped shut, trapping her in the velvet dark with him, she braced for a monster. She never expected the quiet humanity that followed. The parlour of the Fairchild estate was always cold. It wasn't a weather-dependent chill, but a deep, architectural dampness that seemed to seep from the very floorboards. Josephine stood near the hearth, though the grate had been empty since morning. Coal was expensive. Lady Margaret preferred to spend her late husband's dwindling fortune on imported silks and high-stakes whist rather than something as pedestrian as warmth. Josephine rubbed her hands together. Her knuckles were raw, the skin split from scrubbing the stone steps before dawn. She wore a faded grey muslin dress that had once belonged to her cousin, hemmed up hastily to keep her from tripping. She looked exactly like what she was, the unwanted orphan of a disgraced younger brother, a burden kept only for the free labour she provided. Across the room, Lady Margaret sat behind a mahogany writing desk. She was a sharp, angular woman whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of mild distaste. She was currently tapping a dry quill against the blotter. "Stand up straight, Josephine. You look like a street urchin." Margaret didn't look up as she spoke. Her voice was flat, bored. Josephine straightened her spine. The movement pulled at a bruise between her shoulder blades, a lingering reminder of yesterday's failure to iron Margaret's collars to exact specifications. She said nothing. Speaking only ever prolonged the cruelty. A heavy clock ticked in the corner. It was 10 minutes past the hour. "If he has reconsidered, I shall have you out on the street by nightfall," Margaret murmured, finally setting the quill down. £4,000. It is entirely too much for a girl with no dowry, no connections, and a face as plain as a wooden spoon. I can only assume the Duke is desperate, or mad. The rumours certainly suggest the latter. Josephine kept her eyes on the worn pattern of the rug. She knew the rumours. Kevin, the Duke of Whitmore, a recluse who lived in a sprawling, decaying manor in the north. A man who had returned from the continent with a ruined face and a violent temper. They said he had thrown a footman from a second-story window for speaking out of turn. They said he kept entirely to the dark, a phantom of a man. And Margaret had sold her to him, to cover a season of disastrous gambling debts. A heavy knock echoed through the quiet house. Josephine's breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary betrayal of her iron-clad composure. The parlour doors opened. The butler, a thin man who looked as starved as the rest of the staff, stepped aside. "His Grace, the Duke of Whitmore," the butler announced. His voice wavered. Josephine forced herself to look up. She had expected a monster, something hulking and grotesque, draped in shadows. The man who ducked his head to clear the doorframe was massive, yes, but entirely human. He wore a heavy wool greatcoat that smelled faintly of rain and horses. He didn't carry a cane, though he favoured his left leg slightly as he stepped into the room. He pulled off his leather gloves. His hands were large, weather-beaten, not the soft, manicured hands of the aristocracy. When he looked at Margaret, his expression was completely unreadable. Then he turned his head, and Josephine saw the scar. It was a jagged, vicious burn that started at his left temple and dragged down his jaw, pulling the skin tight and distorting the line of his cheek. It was a violent mark, yet his eyes, a muted slate grey, were startlingly calm. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice dripping with sudden, syrupy warmth. She stood, offering a shallow curtsy. "I trust your journey from the city was not too arduous?" Kevin did not return the pleasantry. He did not even look at her. His gaze was fixed on Josephine. He took in her thin dress, her shivering frame, the raw state of her hands. A muscle ticked in his unscarred cheek. "Do you have the papers?" His voice was gravel, low, rough, and entirely devoid of inflection. Margaret's smile faltered. "Yes, of course. Everything is in order. A special license has already been procured. The funds—" "My man of business will transfer the funds by noon," Kevin interrupted. He walked toward the desk. He didn't swagger. His steps were deliberate, measured. He took the quill Margaret offered, dipped it, and signed his name with a few harsh scratches. He didn't read it. He didn't negotiate. He treated the purchase of a human life with the same mechanical efficiency one might use to buy a cartload of oats. "Excellent," Margaret breathed, rolling the paper. "Josephine, fetch your things." "I have nothing to fetch," Josephine said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. Kevin paused, his hand hovering over the inkwell. He looked at her again, really looked at her. "Nothing?" he asked. "Everything I wear belongs to my aunt," Josephine stated, looking him dead in the eye. She refused to cower. If he was going to beat her, if he was going to lock her in a cellar, she would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. "I have no possessions, Your Grace," Margaret scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "The girl is dramatic, but she is yours now. Do with her what you will. I have washed my hands of the burden." Kevin looked back at Margaret. For a fraction of a second, the heavy, deadened look in his eyes cracked, revealing something so sharply violent that Josephine felt the air leave her lungs. It was a terrifying, quiet fury. But it was gone in an instant. He turned to Josephine. "Come," was all he said. He didn't wait to see if she followed. He turned and walked out of the parlor. Josephine didn't look at her aunt. She didn't say goodbye. She walked out into the damp, grey morning, the cold biting through her thin soles, and climbed into the waiting carriage. She was entirely alone. She was entirely terrified. But she was finally out of that house. The interior of the Duke's carriage was vastly different from the austere rot of the Fairchild estate. It smelled of oiled leather, clean wool, and a faint, lingering trace of pipe tobacco. It was warm. Under the velvet seats, metal bricks filled with hot coals radiated a steady, glorious heat. Josephine sat stiffly in the corner, pressing herself as far into the upholstery as she could. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their shaking. Kevin sat opposite her. He took up an enormous amount of space, his broad shoulders easily spanning half the width of the carriage. He was looking out the window, watching the rain-slicked streets of London give way to the sprawling green of the countryside. He had not spoken a word since he told her to come. They had been driving for an hour. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken questions. Josephine's mind raced through 1,000 terrifying scenarios. He was going to use her for breeding. He was going to make her a scullery maid. He was a sadist who bought a wife because no woman would willingly endure him. She watched him covertly. He was reading a small, leather-bound book now. He didn't look like a madman. He looked tired. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and there was a permanent, exhausted tension in his shoulders. A sudden jolt in the road sent the carriage pitching sideways. Josephine, untethered and exhausted, slid across the leather seat. She gasped, expecting to hit the floorboards, but a large, gloved hand shot out and caught her by the upper arm. His grip was immovable, but it wasn't painful. He steadied her, pulling her back upright. "My apologies," Kevin said. He immediately released her and pulled his hand back, resting it on his knee. "The roads in this county are notoriously poor." Josephine stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited for him to reprimand her for her clumsiness. She waited for the sharp backhand her aunt would have delivered. Instead, he reached down onto the floor, picked up a thick, woolen blanket, and tossed it onto the seat beside her. "You are shivering," he said. He didn't look at her when he said it. His eyes were back on his book. "Use it." Josephine stared at the blanket. It was thick, heavy, woven with dark blue threads. It looked incredibly warm. She hesitated. In her experience, nothing was ever free. Every kindness was a trap, a debt to be collected later with interest. "I am fine, Your Grace," she lied, her teeth clattering together. Kevin slowly lowered his book. He looked at her. His gaze was heavy, dissecting. He noted the blue tint of her lips, the violent tremors racking her thin frame, the way she shrank back against the carriage wall. "I have no interest in playing games, Josephine," he said quietly. His voice wasn't cruel, just profoundly weary. "I am not testing you. You are cold. The blanket is warm. Put it on." He raised the book again, dismissing her. Josephine swallowed hard. With trembling hands, she reached out and pulled the heavy wool over her lap. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. It smelled like the carriage, clean, masculine, safe. She pulled it up to her chin, closing her eyes for a brief moment as the agonizing chill began to recede from her bones. The rest of the journey passed in silence. Josephine dozed fitfully, caught between the exhaustion of her previous life and the terror of her new one. They arrived at Whitmore Manor just as the sun was setting, casting the sky in bruised shades of purple and grey. Josephine woke with a start as the carriage rolled to a halt. She looked out the window. She had expected a fortress, a crumbling, Gothic monstrosity crawling with ivy and despair. Whitmore Manor was certainly large, built of dark, weathered stone, but it was profoundly alive. Warm, golden light spilled from dozens of mullioned windows. Smoke curled cheerfully from the chimneys. As the carriage doors opened, the sound of deep, booming barks echoed across the gravel drive. Two massive Irish wolfhounds bounded down the front steps, their tails wagging furiously. They launched themselves at Kevin the moment his boots hit the ground. "Down, Brutus! Off, Cassius!" Kevin ordered. The words were a command, but his tone was fond. He scratched one of the massive beasts behind the ears before turning back to the carriage. He didn't offer his hand to Josephine. He seemed to know she wouldn't want him to touch her. He simply stood back, giving her space to descend. A woman stood on the front steps. She was older, pleasantly plump, wearing a pristine white apron over a dark dress. She had kind, crinkling eyes and held a ring of heavy iron keys. "Your Grace," she said, dipping into a curtsy, "we did not expect you back so soon." "The business concluded faster than anticipated, Mrs. Gable," Kevin replied. He gestured toward Josephine, who stood frozen on the gravel, clutching the blue blanket around her shoulders. "This is Josephine. She is to be the new mistress of the house." Mrs. Gable didn't gasp. She didn't look horrified or confused. She simply looked at Josephine, taking in the bruised exhaustion, the thin dress, and the defensive posture. Her expression softened into something that looked dangerously like pity. "Welcome to Whitmore, my lady," Mrs. Gable said gently. "Come inside out of the damp. You look half frozen." Kevin walked past them, the dogs trailing at his heels. He paused at the heavy oak doors. "Put her in the east wing, Mrs. Gable, the rose room, and have a bath drawn." He didn't look back as he crossed the threshold. "I will take my supper in the study." Josephine stood on the gravel, the rain beginning to spot her face. the east wing, a separate wing of the house. He wasn't taking her to his bed. She gripped the blanket tighter, a cynical voice in her head, whispering that he was simply waiting until she was clean. Monsters always preferred their prey presentable. But as she followed the housekeeper into the warm, brightly lit foyer, a tiny, unfamiliar seed of doubt planted itself in her chest. The Rose Room was not a prison cell. It was the most beautiful room Josephine had ever seen. The walls were papered in a soft, muted gold. A massive four-poster bed dominated the space, piled high with feather quilts and crisp linen. A fire roared in the marble hearth, chasing away every shadow. Mrs. Gable was efficient and quiet. She directed 2 maids to fill a copper tub with steaming water, laced with lavender oil. She laid out a soft flannel nightgown, much too large, clearly belonging to someone else, and a thick robe. "I will leave you to wash, my lady," Mrs. Gable said, pausing by the door. "I will bring up a tray when you are finished. You must be starved." Josephine nodded stiffly. "Thank you." When the door clicked shut, Josephine stood motionless for a long time. She listened. Heavy footsteps in the hall. No sound of a key turning in the lock. She walked to the door and tested the handle. It turned freely. She approached the copper tub. She hadn't had a hot bath in 3 years. At her aunt's house, she was allotted a bucket of tepid water once a week, to be used quickly in the drafty washroom. She stripped off her damp, ragged dress and stepped into the water. The heat was a physical shock. It stung her raw hands and the fading bruises on her arms. She scrubbed herself raw, washing away the grime of London, the scent of the Fairchild house, the lingering fear of the journey. When she was dry, she put on the oversized nightgown. The flannel was incredibly soft against her skin. She sat by the fire, brushing out her wet, tangled hair, waiting. Mrs. Gable returned 20 minutes later with a heavy silver tray. There was roasted chicken, potatoes swimming in butter, thick slices of bread, and a pot of tea. Josephine ate with a calculated restraint. Her stomach ached with hunger, but she forced herself to chew slowly. She ate half the food, then carefully took a silver butter knife from the tray. She slipped it up the sleeve of her robe. It was a dull, useless thing, but the weight of it against her wrist was grounding. It was a weapon. It was control. An hour passed. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Then came a soft knock at the door. Josephine stiffened. Her fingers curled around the handle of the hidden knife. The reprieve was over. "Enter," she called out. Her voice sounded thin, frail. The door opened. Kevin stood in the threshold. He had discarded his heavy greatcoat and cravat. He wore a simple linen shirt, open at the collar, and dark trousers. Without the coat, she could see the sheer breadth of him. He looked like a man who could snap a timber beam over his knee. He did not step into the room. He kept one hand on the doorframe, his weight resting entirely in the hallway. "Are the accommodations satisfactory?" he asked. His voice was low in the quiet house. "Yes, Your Grace. Thank you." Josephine remained seated by the fire, her back ramrod straight. She watched him, cataloguing his movements, assessing the threat. Kevin looked at the half-empty tray. He looked at her tense shoulders. He looked at the way her right was tucked awkwardly into her left sleeve. He was incredibly observant. He let out a slow, heavy breath and looked up at the ceiling for a moment, as if praying for patience. "You do not need to hide the cutlery, Josephine," he said flatly. Josephine froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind scrambled for a lie, for an excuse, but his gaze was too piercing. He wasn't angry. He just sounded tired. She started, then stopped. Kevin leaned against the doorframe. He crossed his arms over his chest. "Let us speak plainly," he said. "You think I am a tyrant. You think I bought you to abuse you, to use you, or to make you a servant in a different house. You are waiting for me to demand my rights as your husband." Josephine swallowed the lump of panic in her throat. "Are you not?" "No," Kevin said. The word was definitive. A heavy stone dropped into a quiet pool. He looked at her, his scarred face illuminated by the hallway sconce. "I knew your father, years ago, before the war. He was a good man. He did me a great service." Josephine's eyes widened. Her father. She hadn't heard anyone speak of him with respect since he died. "I learned of your circumstances only recently," Kevin continued, his jaw tightening slightly. "I approached your aunt. I offered to take you in as a ward. She refused. She said you were too valuable an asset to the household. When I realized the extent of her debts, I realized there was only one legal way to remove you from her custody permanently without her interference. You bought my debt," Josephine whispered, the pieces falling into place. "I bought you your freedom," Kevin corrected quietly. "The marriage is a legal fiction. It protects you from her. That is all it is." Josephine stared at him. The cynic in her screamed that this was a trick. Men did not pay £4,000 out of the goodness of their hearts. Men did not rescue orphaned girls without expecting a pound of flesh in return. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling now, the armor cracking. "Why would you do that?" "Because no one should be made to live like a dog in their own family's home," Kevin said. His voice was harsh, sudden, betraying a flash of the quiet violence she had seen in the parlor. It wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the memory of her aunt. He pushed off the doorframe and took a step back into the hall. "You are not a prisoner here, Josephine. You are the Duchess of Whitmore. You may run this house, or you may ignore it entirely. You may ride, read, walk the grounds, or sleep until noon. No one will raise a hand to you. No one will demand your labor, and I will never force my presence upon you." He reached out and took hold of the brass doorknob. "The lock on this door is new," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "It locks from the inside. Use it. Get some sleep." He pulled the door shut. The click of the latch echoed in the silent room. Josephine sat frozen by the fire. The silence of the house pressed in on her, heavy and absolute. She waited for a trick. She waited for him to burst back in. Minutes ticked by. The fire popped, throwing a shower of sparks against the iron grate. Slowly, shakily, she stood up. She walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she reached out and turned the brass deadbolt. It slid into place with a solid, metallic thud. She stepped back. She looked at the locked door. She looked at the hidden butter knife, still clutched in her hand. She walked over to the tray and set the knife down. Then, for the first time in 3 years, Josephine sank to the floor, buried her face in her hands, and wept. Not from terror, but from the overwhelming, terrifying weight of unexpected kindness. Sunlight was a harsh intruder. It slashed across the Persian rug, pooling in a bright, warm rectangle at the foot of the bed. Josephine woke with a violent jolt. Her heart thrashed against her ribs, her hands instantly curling into fists to defend against the inevitable sharp reprimand for oversleeping. The reprimand did not come. The silence of the room was absolute, save for the crackle of the newly stoked fire. She sat up, the heavy feather quilt pooling around her waist. She was in the rose room. The brass lock on the door was still engaged. Someone, presumably a maid, moving with impossible stealth, had slipped in through the adjoining dressing room, built the fire, left a pitcher of steaming water on the washstand, and departed without making a sound. Josephine swung her legs out of bed. The floorboards were warm near the hearth. She approached the washstand and stared at her reflection in the oval mirror. She looked exactly as she had yesterday, hollow-cheeked, pale, defensive. But the tension in her neck had marginally lessened. On the velvet armchair near the window lay a dark green woolen day dress. It was unadorned, lacking the lace and ribbons of London society, but the fabric was thick and exquisitely woven. Beside it lay clean undergarments and soft leather slippers. She dressed quickly. The gown fit perfectly. Kevin, or perhaps Mrs. Gable, had an unnerving eye for practical necessities. Unlocking her bedroom door felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Josephine crept into the hallway. The house was enormous, a labyrinth of dark wood paneling, faded tapestries, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. As she navigated the corridors, her mind automatically began to catalogue the environment. It was a survival mechanism honed over 3 years of misery under her aunt's roof. She mentally filed her observations. The exits. There was a grand staircase leading to the front foyer, but also a narrow servants' stairwell at the end of the east wing that smelled of lye and baked bread. The staff. They did not avert their eyes in fear when she passed. 2 maids dusting a credenza offered polite curtsies and warm, genuine smiles. There was no terror in this house. The master. Kevin was nowhere to be seen. She found her way to the breakfast room. A buffet was laid out on a mahogany sideboard. Eggs, cured ham, kippers, fresh bread, and preserves. She ate standing up, keeping her back to the wall, watching the door. She ate until she felt almost sick. Then, out of pure instinct, wrapped a thick slice of bread in a linen napkin and shoved it deep into the pocket of her dress. "The Duke took his breakfast at dawn, my lady." Josephine spun around. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, a stack of freshly pressed linens in her arms. "He is currently with the estate manager in the lower fields," the housekeeper continued, her tone conversational, entirely ignoring Josephine's startled flinch. "He asked me to inform you that the library is unlocked, should you wish to read. The gardens are also quite pleasant, though the ground is soft from yesterday's rain." Josephine unclenched her hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. Will you be requiring anything else, Your Grace?" Your Grace? The title sounded absurd, directed at her. "No. I will take a walk." She stepped out the French doors into the morning air. Whitmore Manor was not merely a house. It was a sprawling, working estate. Beyond the manicured lawns lay vast expanses of pasture, thick woodlands and tenant farms. She walked for an hour, her new leather slippers sinking into the damp earth. She saw Kevin from a distance. He was standing near a stone fence, speaking with a man on horseback. The massive Irish wolfhounds were weaving through the tall grass around his boots. He wore no hat, the wind whipping his dark hair. Even from 300 yards away, the sheer, grounded authority of the man was undeniable. He belonged to the land. He did not look toward the house. He did not look for her. Josephine turned back toward the manor. The cold reality of her situation was settling into her bones. She was safe. She was fed. She was ignored. For a dog that had been kicked its entire life, being ignored was a profound relief. But as she touched the stolen bread in her pocket, a cynical, biting thought pierced her fragile calm. Nothing is free. If you do not earn your keep, you will eventually be discarded. She needed to find a way to make herself indispensable. 3 days passed. They were an agonizing exercise in luxury and paranoia. Josephine woke, ate, read in the sprawling library, and walked the grounds. She saw Kevin only at dinner. They sat at opposite ends of a long oak table. The meals were quiet. He would ask a perfunctory question about her comfort. She would give a brief, polite answer. Then, the silence would stretch between them, filled only by the clinking of silver against porcelain. He did not pry into her past. He did not attempt to charm her. He treated her with the careful, distant respect one might afford a skittish house cat. By the fourth afternoon, the idleness became unbearable. It felt like a trap. Josephine's anxiety spiked. If she contributed nothing, she was a parasite. Parasites were exterminated. She found Kevin in his study. The door was ajar. Josephine paused in the hallway, peering in. The study was a mess. Books were stacked haphazardly on the floor. The desk was buried under a mountain of loose parchment, maps, and heavy, leather-bound ledgers. Kevin sat behind the desk, his massive frame hunched over a ledger. He had a quill clenched in his hand, a smear of black ink on his unscarred cheek. He looked thoroughly, profoundly miserable. "Damn it all to hell," he muttered quietly, dragging a hand through his hair. Josephine knocked on the open door frame. Kevin's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before the guarded, neutral expression slammed back into place. He set the quill down and stood up immediately. "Josephine," he said, "is something amiss?" "No," she said, stepping into the room. She kept her posture rigid. "I apologize for the intrusion." "You are not intruding." He gestured vaguely to one of the leather wingback chairs opposite his desk. "Sit, if you like." She did not sit. She stepped closer to the desk, her eyes scanning the chaos. "You appear frustrated, Your Grace." Kevin let out a short, humorless breath. "I am a soldier, Josephine. I know how to move men, how to read terrain, and how to breed horses. I do not know how to untangle 7 years of financial mismanagement left by my late brother." He tapped the open ledger with a bruised knuckle. "These numbers are a fiction. The estate is bleeding money, and I cannot find the wound." Josephine looked at the ledger. The columns were messy, the handwriting cramped. At her aunt's house, Josephine had been the unseen engine that kept the household running. Lady Margaret was too busy gambling to manage the accounts. It had fallen to Josephine to balance the books, to stretch the pennies, to argue with the butcher and the coal merchant, and to hide the devastating extent of her aunt's debts from the creditors. She understood numbers. Numbers, unlike people, didn't lie. "May I?" she asked, reaching a hand toward the book. Kevin looked surprised, but he stepped back, yielding the space. Josephine pulled the ledger toward her. She didn't bother to sit. Her eyes tracked down the columns of expenditures and yields. Within seconds, the familiar architecture of theft revealed itself to her. "Your brother did not mismanage this, Your Grace," she said flatly. "Kevin," he corrected quietly. "If we are to live in the same house, you will call me Kevin." She paused, the intimacy of his Christian name feeling heavy on her tongue. She pushed past it. "Kevin, this is not mismanagement. It is theft. And it is not very clever theft." Kevin crossed his arms over his chest. The heavy, exhausted slope of his shoulders vanished, replaced by the sharp, focused attention of a predator catching a scent. "Show me." Josephine turned the book around. She pointed a slender finger at the page. "Here. The grain yields for the Western Tenant Farms. They are recorded at 40 bushels an acre, but look at the transit costs recorded 2 pages over." She flipped the page quickly. The cartage fees paid to the drivers correspond to a yield of 60 bushels an acre. Someone is selling the 20-bushel difference directly to the market and pocketing the coin before it reaches the estate. Kevin stared at the numbers. He looked back at her. You saw that in 10 seconds. I spent 3 years hiding my aunt's ruin from the bankers of London, Josephine said, her voice devoid of emotion. I know what a doctored book looks like. Kevin walked around the desk. He stood beside her, close enough that she could smell the starch of his shirt and the faint scent of rain. But he kept a careful, deliberate distance, ensuring their arms did not brush. Where else? He asked. For the next 2 hours they stood shoulder to shoulder at the desk. Josephine ruthlessly dissected the ledgers. She found padded expenses for building repairs that were never made, inflated feed costs for the stables, and phantom laborers drawing wages from the estate coffers. She was entirely in her element. The crippling anxiety that had plagued her all morning evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard logic of mathematics. She spoke sharply, concisely. Kevin listened. He did not interrupt her. He did not dismiss her. He absorbed her words with a tearing intensity. The estate manager, Kevin finally said, his voice dropping an octave. It was a dark, dangerous sound. Mr. Hastings. He has been in the position for a decade. Then Mr. Hastings is a very wealthy man, Josephine concluded, closing the ledger with a definitive thud. Kevin leaned back against the edge of the desk. He looked down at her. His grey eyes were stripping away her defenses, seeing right through the stoic facade to the sharp, calculating mind beneath. I bought a duchess, he murmured, almost to himself. It seems I gained a quartermaster. Josephine stiffened. The instinct to retreat surged. If I am to eat your food and sleep under your roof, I must be of use. I will not be a burden. Kevin's jaw tightened. The faint trace of amusement vanished from his eyes. I didn't buy you to balance my books, Josephine. I bought you so you could breathe. People do not spend £4,000 so a stranger can breathe, she shot back, her cynicism finally breaking through her polite veneer. Everything has a cost. I prefer to pay my debts directly. Silence stretched between them, heavy and taut as a wire. Kevin looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then he reached over and pulled the stack of remaining ledgers toward him. Very well, he said, his voice devoid of anger. If you insist on paying a debt that does not exist, you may manage the interior accounts. I will deal with Hastings. He did not thank her. He did not offer empty platitudes. He simply recognized her boundary and accepted it. It was the most profound respect she had ever been shown. The firing of Mr. Hastings was a quiet, brutal affair. Josephine did not witness it, but she felt the ripple effect through the household. By dinner the following evening, the estate had a new, temporary manager, and the air in the manor felt lighter, as if a rot had been excised from the floorboards. Josephine took control of the household ledgers. She set up a small workspace in the library, claiming a desk by the eastern window. Mrs. Gable surrendered the household accounts with a sigh of profound relief, admitting that mathematics made her eyes cross. For a week, a rhythm established itself. It was the closest thing to peace Josephine had ever known. Late one Tuesday afternoon, the rain returned. It battered against the library windows, a relentless, grey deluge that plunged the room into premature twilight. Josephine sat at her desk, her brow furrowed, trying to reconcile a discrepancy in the butcher's bill. Kevin was across the room, seated by the roaring fire. He was reading a thick volume on crop rotation. They had occupied the same room for 3 hours, exchanging fewer than 10 words. It was a comfortable, entirely undemanding silence. The heavy oak doors of the library swung open. Thomas, a young footman who had only been employed for a month, hurried into the room. He was carrying a massive brass scuttle overflowing with chopped firewood. He was practically a boy, gangly and uncoordinated, his arms straining under the weight of the oak logs. "Apologies, Your Grace," Thomas panted, aiming for the hearth. Mrs. Gable said the fire was getting low. "Take your time, Thomas," Kevin said mildly, not looking up from his book. Thomas rushed. He crossed the Persian rug, his wet boots slipping slightly on the polished wood border. He caught his balance, but the momentum swung the heavy brass scuttle. The edge of the scuttle slammed hard against the marble surround of the fireplace. The sound was a deafening, metallic crash. It echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Two things happened simultaneously. The bottom of the scuttle gave way. 30 pounds of heavy oak logs spilled out, crashing onto the marble hearth and the iron fire dogs with a cacophony of splintering wood and ringing metal. And Josephine shattered. The sudden, violent noise bypassed her logic entirely. It tapped directly into the primal, beaten animal residing in her brain. At her aunt's house, loud noises meant a drunken rage. A crash meant something was broken, and someone was going to bleed for it. Before the last log hit the floor, Josephine was out of her chair. She scrambled backward, her hands flying up to cover her head. Her hip slammed into the edge of her desk, knocking her inkwell to the floor, where it shattered, sending a pool of black ink spreading across the rug. She didn't feel the pain. She backed herself into the corner of the room, pressing her spine against the bookshelves, sliding down until she was curled on the floor, making herself as small a target as possible. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing coming in harsh, hyperventilating gasps. She waited for the shouting. She waited for the heavy footsteps. She waited for the blow. "Get out!" Kevin's voice was not a shout. It was a low, terrifyingly calm rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "Your Grace, I am so sorry, I slipped," Thomas stammered, his voice cracking with pure terror. "Leave the wood, leave the room, now!" The footman scrambled over the logs and bolted from the library, shutting the door behind him. The room plunged back into silence, save for the crackle of the fire and the ragged, desperate sound of Josephine's breathing. She kept her hands over her head. She was trapped in the corner. She knew she was acting like a madwoman. She knew she was embarrassing herself. But her muscles were locked in a rigid cage of panic, expecting the violence that had conditioned her for 3 years. She heard a sound, a quiet, shuffling movement. He was coming. She squeezed her eyes tighter, bracing for impact. Josephine. His voice was not above her. It was entirely level with her. She forced one eye open, dropping her left arm a fraction of an inch. Kevin was not standing over her. The massive, towering Duke had crossed the room, but he had stopped 10 feet away from her. He was kneeling on the floor. He had lowered himself entirely, putting his knees onto the hard wood, ensuring he was not looking down at her. His hands were placed flat on his own thighs, completely visible, completely still. "I am not going to touch you," he said. His voice was steady, slow, and remarkably gentle. It was the voice one might use to coax a wounded horse out of a burning barn. "You are safe." Josephine stared at him, her chest heaving. I broke the inkwell," she choked out, a hysterical sob threatening to break her voice. "The rug." "Damn the rug," Kevin said quietly. "Look at me, Josephine." She met his eyes. The slate grey was entirely clear of anger. There was no pity either. Pity was condescending. What she saw in his face was a profound, agonizing understanding. It was the look of a man who knew exactly what it felt like to expect a blow. "You are in Whitmore," he said, speaking slowly, letting every word carry its full weight. "No one in this house will ever strike you. No one will ever raise their voice to you. I would burn this manor to the ground before I allowed anyone to make you feel fear again." He didn't move an inch toward her. He stayed kneeling, offering his total submission to her panic, letting her control the space. "Breathe with me," he instructed gently. Josephine kept her back pressed against the books. She watched his chest rise and fall. Slowly, agonizingly, she forced her own breathing to match his rhythm. The frantic drumming of her heart began to slow. The suffocating terror receded, leaving behind a humiliating, hollow exhaustion. She lowered her arms completely. She looked at her trembling hands. They were smeared with black ink from the shattered well. Kevin saw the ink. He did not reach for her. He simply pulled a clean linen handkerchief from his pocket and tossed it gently across the floor. It landed softly near her knee. "Take your time," Kevin said. He did not stand up. He remained kneeling on the hard floor, a scarred gargoyle, keeping a quiet, immovable watch until Josephine was finally ready to stand on her own. The stain remained on the rug, a jagged, dark ink blot, marring the perfect, faded gold of the Persian silk. Mrs. Gable had offered to have it scrubbed with lemon and salt. When that failed, she gently suggested rolling the rug up and moving it to a lesser-used guest room. Josephine refused. She left the rug exactly where it was, positioning her newly organized desk so that her chair sat right beside the ruined silk. It was a reminder, a physical marker of the exact moment she had expected the world to end, and instead found the floor solidly beneath her feet. The dynamic in Whitmore Manor shifted subtly in the weeks following the incident in the library. Josephine stopped walking with her shoulders hunched. She stopped hoarding bread in her pockets. The realization that Kevin's promise was absolute, that he would never strike her, never force her, never demand anything beyond her existence, acted like sunlight on a starved plant. She did not become suddenly vivacious or outwardly joyful. The trauma of 3 years was not erased by a month of peace, but she became formidable. She took over the running of the house with a ruthless, terrifying efficiency. She renegotiated the contracts with the local butchers and coal merchants, slashing the estate's domestic spending by a third simply by refusing to be intimidated by the tradesmen who had grown fat off the previous duke's inattention. She organized the staff not through fear, but through absolute, unyielding competence. They respected her because she worked harder than any of them, often found awake at midnight in the library, a single candle burning as she audited the quarterly returns. Kevin watched this transformation with a silent, intense fascination. They still spent their evenings in the library. It was an unspoken routine. He would read his agricultural treatises. She would manage the books. But the silence between them was no longer the tense, wary quiet of two strangers trapped in a cage. It was a companionable, heavy peace. One evening in late November, the first real snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the Yorkshire moors in heavy white. The library was suffocatingly warm, the fire roaring in the hearth. Kevin closed his book with a soft thud. He rubbed a hand over his face, his fingers grazing the jagged edge of his scarred jaw. He looked exhausted. "The Eastern Tenant farms are failing," he said suddenly. It was the first time he had spoken in 2 hours. Josephine did not look up from her ledger. She carefully dipped her quill in the new, heavy brass inkwell Kevin had quietly placed on her desk the week prior. "I know," she replied. "The soil is too acidic. Your brother overplanted wheat for 5 consecutive years to drive up short-term profits. He drained the land." Kevin leaned back in his leather chair. "You read the agricultural reports?" "I read everything that costs this estate money," Josephine stated, finally turning her head to look at him. "You cannot plant wheat there again in the spring. It will yield half of what it did this year, and you will lose money on the seed alone. Then what do you suggest, my ruthless quartermaster? A ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a rare expression, one that completely transformed his harsh face, making him look surprisingly young. Josephine turned her chair entirely to face him. She felt a strange flutter in her chest at the sight of that smile, a sensation she immediately clamped down on with cold logic. "Turnips," she said firmly. Kevin stared at her. "Turnips?" "Yes, or clover. You need to fix the nitrogen in the soil. You use the eastern fields for grazing the sheep this spring. Let the land rest, and plant a root crop to break up the hardpan." She stood up, retrieving a rolled map from a side table and bringing it over to him. She didn't hesitate to invade his space, spreading the map over his knees. "If you move the primary grazing herds here, you sacrifice short-term grain profit, but you save the acreage for the next decade." Kevin looked down at the map, then up at her. She was standing inches from him, her finger tracing the boundary lines of the estate. The scent of lavender soap and old paper clung to her. He didn't look at the map. He looked at her eyes. "You have saved this estate from ruin in less than 2 months, he said, his voice dropping to that low, rumbling register that vibrated right through her ribs. "I bought a wife to spite a cruel woman, and I accidentally bought a savior." Josephine stiffened slightly, pulling her hand back. The word "bought" always hung between them, a cold reminder of the transaction that bound them. "I am securing my own survival," she said, her voice turning crisp. "An impoverished duke cannot provide a warm house." Kevin's gaze softened. He saw right through the armor. He slowly reached out. He didn't touch her hand, but he tapped a finger against the map, right where her hand had just been. "Your survival has been secure since the moment you stepped into my carriage, Josephine," he said quietly. "Everything you do now, you do because it is yours. This estate is yours. You are not a guest here. You are the Duchess." Josephine looked at his large, rough hand resting on the parchment. For the first time in her life, she felt a terrifying, overwhelming urge to close the distance, to lay her hand over his, to feel the warmth of another human being without the expectation of pain. She didn't do it. The fear was still too deep. She took a step back. "I will draft the new grazing schedules in the morning," she said, turning back to her desk. Kevin watched her retreat. He didn't push. He never pushed. He simply nodded, picking his book back up. "Thank you, Josephine." The isolation of Whitmore Manor was shattered 3 days before Christmas. Josephine was in the grand foyer, directing 2 footmen on the precise placement of a massive pine garland over the main staircase, when the heavy knocker on the front door pounded with an arrogant, demanding rhythm. Mrs. Gable hurried to open it. A blast of freezing air swept into the hall, followed immediately by Lord Cavendish. Cavendish was a wealthy neighboring landowner. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored velvet coat and a pristine silk cravat, his silver-tipped cane striking the stone floor with sharp, authoritative clicks. He had a fleshy, red face and eyes that held the perpetual sneer of a man who believed his bloodline excused his complete lack of manners. "Mrs. Gable," Cavendish barked, handing his dripping hat to the housekeeper without looking at her. "Tell your master I have arrived. I assume he is in the stables, or sulking in the dark." Josephine stood perfectly still on the second step of the staircase. She watched the man. She knew his type intimately. Her aunt's parlor had been filled with men just like him, men who measured a person's worth entirely by their pedigree and their bank accounts. "The Duke is currently reviewing the quarterly audits in his study, my lord," Josephine said. Her voice cut through the cold air of the foyer, sharp and clear as crystal. Cavendish stopped. He turned, his eyes sweeping up the staircase. He took in her simple, dark wool dress, the severe knot of her hair, and her pale, unsmiling face. A patronizing smirk stretched across his lips. "Ah, you must be the new acquisition," Cavendish said. He didn't bow. The rumor in London is that Whitmore bought himself a desperate little mouse to warm his bed, because no lady of standing would look twice at his ruined face. "I am Lord Cavendish. Fetch your husband, girl." A heavy, dangerous silence fell over the foyer. The two footmen holding the garland froze, their eyes wide with terror. Mrs. Gable drew in a sharp breath. Josephine did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. A cold, absolute fury settled into her bones. It wasn't a frantic panic. It was a glacial, paralyzing anger. She descended the 2 stairs slowly. She walked across the stone floor, stopping 3 feet from Cavendish. She was smaller than him, slighter than him, but she carried the absolute authority of a woman who held the financial lifeblood of a massive estate in her head. "You are standing in my house, Lord Cavendish," Josephine said, her voice terrifyingly quiet. "You are tracking mud onto my floors, and you are speaking disrespectfully of my husband. You will correct your tone, or you will wait for him outside in the snow." Cavendish barked a laugh, though it sounded uncertain. "Bold words for a penniless orphan. I am here on business. Business your husband desperately needs. His brother owed me £3,000. I am here to collect, or I am here to take the western pastures in lieu of payment. I know this estate is bankrupt. The whole county knows. The previous duke's debts were settled entirely by my husband upon his assumption of the title," Josephine replied smoothly, not missing a beat. "Furthermore, the western pastures are currently yielding a 20% higher return than your own poorly managed fields bordering them. We have no interest in selling land to a man who cannot even properly rotate his own crops." Cavendish's red face turned a mottled purple. "How dare you? What is the disturbance here?" The deep, gravelly voice echoed from the hallway. Kevin stepped into the foyer. He wore riding boots and a simple linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing thick, scarred forearms. He looked massive, dark, and utterly lethal as he took in the scene. He looked at Cavendish, his grey eyes narrowing. Then he looked at Josephine. Josephine did not retreat behind him. She stood her ground, her spine rigid. "Lord Cavendish was just leaving, Kevin," Josephine said calmly, using his Christian name deliberately, wielding it like a shield. "He seems to be under the mistaken impression that this estate is in financial distress, and that he can speak to the Duchess of Whitmore as though she were a scullery maid." Kevin stopped. The lethal tension in his shoulders shifted. He looked at Josephine, staring at her rigid spine, her raised chin, the absolute, unyielding defense she was mounting on his behalf. A look of profound, staggering shock crossed his scarred face, followed instantly by a terrifying, possessive pride. He turned his gaze back to Cavendish. The neighboring lord had suddenly taken a step back, shrinking under the duke's stare. "My wife," Kevin said, and the word hung in the air, heavy and absolute, "speaks for this house. If she says you are leaving, Cavendish, you are leaving. If you ever set foot on my land again, or if you ever speak of my wife with anything less than total reverence, I will drag you behind a horse to the county line." Cavendish opened his mouth, closed it, snatched his hat from the table and practically ran for the door. The heavy oak slammed shut behind him. The foyer was dead quiet. The footmen hurriedly resumed hanging the garland, desperate to make themselves invisible. Kevin stood looking at Josephine. She was still staring at the door, her chest rising and falling rapidly as the adrenaline began to ebb. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "Josephine," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. She turned to face him. Her hands were shaking slightly, the aftermath of the confrontation. "He was insulting you," she said, her voice tight, defensive. "He had no right. He knows nothing of this estate. He knows nothing of you." "You defended me," Kevin said. He sounded completely bewildered. It was the voice of a man who had been bracing for a blow his entire life, only to have someone step in front of the fist. "You are my husband," she said firmly. "And this is my house." Kevin swallowed hard. He reached out, slowly, deliberately. This time he didn't stop. He laid his large, calloused hands on her shoulders. The heat of his palms bled through the thick wool of her dress. It wasn't a confining touch. It was an anchor. "Yes," he whispered, staring down into her fierce, beautiful eyes. "It is." The rest of the day passed in a strange, highly charged blur. Josephine could not shake the feeling of Kevin's hands on her shoulders. It had been the first time he had truly touched her since catching her in the carriage months ago. The touch had not sparked fear. It had sparked something entirely different. A deep, agonizing ache in her chest. A desperate, terrifying hunger for more. That night, the library was quiet, save for the howling of the wind outside. Josephine sat at her desk, staring blindly at a column of numbers. The ledgers were perfect. The house was running flawlessly. She had made herself indispensable. But as she looked across the room at Kevin, bathed in the golden light of the fire, she realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't enough. She didn't want to be his quartermaster. She didn't want to be a charity case he had rescued. She wanted the man. She wanted the scarred, quiet, gentle giant who kneeled on hard floorboards so a broken girl wouldn't be afraid. Kevin looked up from his book. He caught her staring. He didn't look away. He closed the book and set it on the small table beside him. "The books are balanced, Josephine," he said quietly. "The estate is secure. Hastings is gone, Cavendish is cowed, and the staff would gladly walk through fire for you." "Yes," she said softly. Kevin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He clasped his hands together. He looked down at the floor for a long moment before meeting her eyes again. "When I brought you here," he started, his voice heavy with careful deliberation, "I promised you safety. I promised I would never demand anything of you. I meant it." Josephine felt a cold spike of dread in her stomach. He was letting her go. She had fixed his house, and now the transaction was complete. "You have a considerable sum settled upon you in the marriage articles," Kevin continued, his voice devoid of emotion, a man reciting a military report. "If you wish it, you could take a house in London or Bath. You could enter society as a wealthy, independent woman. You would never have to see me or this grim, freezing manor again. You are safe now, Josephine. You are free." He was offering her the world. He was offering her the exact thing she had prayed for every night in her aunt's freezing parlor. Complete independence. Josephine stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. She walked around the desk. She didn't stop a polite distance away. She walked right up to his chair, stopping squarely between his knees. Kevin went completely still. His chest stopped moving. He stared up at her, his slate-gray eyes wide with shock. "Do you want me to leave, Kevin?" she asked. Her voice wasn't a quiet whisper. It was steady, demanding, rooted deep in the floorboards of the house she had claimed. "I want you to be happy," he rasped, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. "I am a scarred, ruined soldier who hides in the dark. You are brilliant. You gave me my home back. I will not hold you in a cage of obligation." "You arrogant, foolish man," Josephine said softly. She reached out. Her hands were no longer shaking. She didn't hide them in her sleeves. She laid her palms flat against his chest, right over his heart. It was hammering wildly, a frantic, desperate rhythm beneath the fine linen of his shirt. "I lived in a cage for 3 years," Josephine said, holding his gaze. "I know what a prison looks like. This is not a prison. This is my home." Kevin let out a shuddering breath. He looked at her hands on his chest, as if he couldn't comprehend that they were real. "I don't want a house in Bath," she continued, her voice softening, stripping away the ruthless quartermaster to reveal the woman beneath. "I don't want society. I want the winter on the moors. I want the dogs ruining the rugs. I want a husband who respects me enough to let me fight my own battles, but stands behind me just in case I fall." She moved her right hand up, slowly, giving him every opportunity to pull away. She touched his face. She didn't touch the smooth, unblemished skin on his right side. She laid her palm directly over the jagged, vicious burn on his left jaw. The skin was tight, uneven beneath her fingertips. Kevin squeezed his eyes shut. A ragged, tortured sound tore from his throat. He turned his face into her palm, pressing his ruined cheek against her soft skin, seeking the warmth he had denied himself for years. He reached up, his large, rough hands wrapping around her waist. He didn't pull her down. He held her with a terrifying, reverent gentleness, as if she were made of glass. "Josephine," he breathed against her skin. "I am not a gentleman. I don't need a gentleman," she whispered, her thumb stroking the edge of his scar. "I need a good one, and you are the best man I have ever known." He opened his eyes. The exhaustion, the guarded walls, the quiet resignation, they were all gone, replaced by a fierce, blazing devotion. He pulled her down into his lap. Josephine went willingly, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder. The smell of rain, wool, and pipe tobacco surrounded her. She felt the solid, immovable weight of his arms locking around her, a fortress built entirely for her protection. The paper transaction was dead. The legal fiction was over. The Duke of Whitmore had paid £4,000 for a broken girl, and in return, she had given him back his humanity. The fire popped loudly in the grate. Josephine did not flinch. She simply closed her eyes, entirely safe in the dark. A £4,000 contract bought her freedom, but it took the courage to trust, to finally bring her home. Josephine and Kevin proved that the deepest scars aren't always visible, and the greatest romance isn't found in grand declarations, but in the quiet, unyielding choice to stand by someone's side. If this grounded, slow-burn love story captivated you, hit the like button and share this video with fellow romance lovers. Don't forget to subscribe for more deeply human, gripping historical dramas. What was your favorite moment between the Duke and his Duchess? Let us know in the comments below.